Welcome to the Earned First podcast. This is Arun Sudhaman, founding editor at Earned First. I'm delighted to be joined today by Ramya Chandrasekaran, who is the Chief Communications Officer at QI Group. Ramya, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. Um, I don't think we've had you on the podcast before. This is the first time.
Yep. I'm actually
Hopefully not the
excited. Thanks for inviting me.
good. You're actually excited, as opposed to with other events where you pretend to be excited. So I think this is good news. um, it's well timed as well. I feel because there are some interesting trends in the market. Of course, we are living in this period. I feel of quite accelerated disruption, and I think your experience is quite relevant uh, for some of these discussions. Um, but before that, can you just tell us a little bit about what QI Group does? Because I think maybe for some listeners, that might be a good place to start.
Okay. So the QI Group is a conglomerate. We have multiple businesses. We are primarily in the consumer industries. So we have business ventures that go into everything from retail to education to e-commerce to lifestyle to hospitality to even heritage watch brands. So, and we're a 28-year-old organization, and I am the chief communications officer for the group.
Great. And you're very global, from what I can see.
Yes. Very
Yeah.
global. Yes.
And you are one of the rare CCOs that I see who is regularly in Africa.
Yes. Actually, I'm not entirely sure who else I know in my line of work from Asia that actually goes that much into Africa.
Yeah, there's one or two other names I could probably recall, um, but it's still relatively unusual, and
Yeah.
not just from Asia. I think even when I think about American-based global CCOs, I don't see many of them traveling to Africa, especially often. So we will get to that as well because I think that's very interesting from a communications and cultural perspective. But first, I want to talk about AI, and we had just come out in our newsletter this week with a big piece on where the industry is in terms of AI. And of course, it's an estimate or a guesstimate. I think it's impossible to really
Yeah.
fully understand and fully take stock of this comms world adoption of AI because it's so varied and fragmented. But you have been on this AI journey, I feel, longer than many of your peers. I recall doing roundtables a couple of years ago in Singapore, and you were already experimenting from an organizational enterprise level with AI at a time when many many other organizations had were not allowing their
Right.
teams to use AI, and I think maybe even your team was not necessarily allowed to use AI, but you were going ahead anyway, which I thought was a was a great attitude. Um, so where are you now on your AI journey?
So, yeah, you're right. When we started talking, I think a few years ago, when you first invited me to one of those AI and comms type roundtables, um, we were actually in a very, very early stage at that point, and it was all about experimenting. And you're right. At that time, I kind of went rogue because there were no policies, there was no governance framework, nothing. So at that point, it was all about, hey, I'm very curious about this, and I encourage my team to get curious about using AI tools in order to increase efficiency, productivity, creativity. And as far as I'm concerned, that experiment paid off, and that was about 2 years ago. So I think we're at that interesting point where AI is no longer something we're experimenting with. It's just part of how we work now. And in my team, especially, it's embedded across everything from how we think about content to how we track conversations and even respond in real time.
Mhm.
And what's been particularly interesting for me is seeing how quickly the barrier to entry has dropped. right? Because I have team members with absolutely no coding background who are now building things on their own to help them with their work. And I just a couple of weeks ago, one of them actually came to me and said he's using Claude Code to build a sentiment dashboard for some of our coverage. And this is a paid service that we would otherwise use, right? And a year ago, I think at least, this would have required a completely different kind of resource. And now it's just about curiosity and initiative. And I think that's where the real opportunity lies, because use of AI is no longer just about efficiency. I think it's also about unlocking capability in places that you don't really expect.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's
yeah,
that's a great way of putting it. I think so much attention has focused on efficiency and automation, and areas like content creation, which are really important.
yeah.
But like you said, there are ways to unlock so many other high value applications of AI within organizations, and perhaps they don't even become apparent until you start experimenting and making it a part of your daily life. It sounds like your teams are quite empowered to do that. I'm wondering how that works. Are there any particular specific guardrails in place?
So the good news is that I've been given a free hand. So I didn't want to put too many. I don't want to call them guardrails. I didn't want to put too many restrictions at this point in time, because as it tends to be, the rate of adoption is uneven. So you have some who are super enthusiastic and some who are still a bit hesitant and don't exactly know what to do, concerned about would AI replace them. So there's always that fear. So one of the things that I did is I included the use of AI and improvement in everything from efficiency to productivity to cost saving as part of their OKRs. Like they work
Mm,
towards a set of OKRs for the rest of the year. So I've
mhm,
incorporated it there. So they have no choice but to figure out how to use it in the right way. Of course,
mhm,
the guardrail that has been put in there is to put in some policies about the use of just or sorry, the reliance 100% on Gen AI for content, whether it's visual or whether it's text-based content. Because I think unless you have a bit of a human sandwich approach where the initial ideas are coming from a human, then you're relying on AI to refine it, to generate something new. And then again, the final version is reviewed by another human. I think these things can get very, very tricky because there's just too much AI slop out there.
there is the change management challenge is often significant when it comes to AI, particularly in terms of persuading, encouraging people who, like you said, are concerned that AI will take their job, or maybe are not, especially keen to use technology for jobs that they've done themselves for years. How did you get around that? Was it just down to OKRs, or was there potentially also a carrot as opposed to just a stick?
So the OKRs definitely helped in a big way. There were those who were naturally curious, so they didn't need a lot of push. In fact, they were very, very excited about it. And they then helped set an example to many of the others, because it's really, at the end of the day, becomes a peer pressure, right? So you're doing something really cool and you're like, hey, listen, look, this is what I did with AI. And somebody else looks at it and say, okay, that's not too bad. Maybe I can try my hand at it, right? The fear always, and this is where the challenge is, it's what I said earlier, is there's just so much stuff that's now being generated using AI. And I'm finding myself constantly asking, is this adding clarity or is it just adding to the noise?
Hmm.
So the role
Yeah.
shifts a bit because you're not the creator anymore and you're the filter. And that's what I try to communicate to my team, that you are now the filter more than the creator.
Wow. Yes, indeed. You're almost the arbiter. Um, there are times I think when AI even complicates what might be a relatively straightforward task. But from your
Yeah.
perspective as a leader, how important is it to model that behavior yourself? You seem like someone who is quite comfortable with experimenting with technology. that's not always that common in the comms world.
I think I've just always been naturally curious. I don't think there's any other way to do a comms role if you're not always naturally curious. Um, because even our comms field is changing so fast. What used to work 10 years ago is no longer working, right? And AI in particular is really just changing how influence actually works. So if you're not keeping up with the times, then you're being left behind.
Yeah. If there were, for listeners of this podcast, maybe one or two specific examples or applications of AI where you have seen, really impressive benefits, what would they be?
So I think the standard answers that everybody gives is really cost saving, increase in productivity and efficiency. But what I'm truly seeing is what I said earlier is people actually experimenting and unlocking capabilities they didn't know they had.
Yeah.
And I think that's what is truly, truly important.
Hmm. And do you have a particular point of view in terms of AI use by your agencies? Because this is starting to become an issue that I hear about more and more often. For example, if agencies are using AI to do their work more quickly or more efficiently, should those cost savings be passed on to the client? Do you have a particular take on that?
So the way we work with agencies is we do the strategy and we rely on them for implementation. So as long as the results are being delivered, I've never really had a problem with how they're using AI. In fact, if they can do the job faster, then we are the better for it. So I've never really gone into that level of micromanagement as to which of my agencies is using AI how. As long as they continue to deliver results, I'm fine with it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting times in the AI world, and I'm sure there will be more to discuss. It feels like the pace is every time we talk about AI, there's something new and some
Yeah.
new application. I think now, of course, with Claude um, taking up a lot of people's bandwidth and attention in terms of its impact on comms functions, but no doubt in a few months there'll be something else we'll be talking about. The other big disruptor I think we've seen in the comms field over the last probably 3 to 5 years is the rise of geopolitics as a communications priority. How are you seeing that from your perspective, particularly given that QI operates in so many markets? Is that changing how you approach communications from a multi market perspective?
I think, okay, that's actually a good question because I think what's changed most is the scope of what comms leaders are now expected to do. Because we're no longer just about explaining business performance or amplifying results, right? I remember talking to somebody in Davos about this exact topic, and we were discussing how we're now expected to interpret geopolitics, read social mood, manage regulatory narratives, and all of this is happening in real time. So the role itself of comms leaders has expanded quite significantly. And what that means is reputation itself has evolved because it's no longer shaped by what you are selling or what you are saying. It's shaped by what you are perceived to stand for. And that the expectation that companies now have to take a position on things has increased significantly. And I think that's where it's beginning to get a bit nuanced. So the challenge is not whether you speak, but whether you have the credibility to speak.
Yeah.
I think we're moving from operating within rules of operation to operating within shifting fault lines,
Yeah,
if that
sure.
makes sense.
It does, but it's complicated, right? If
Yeah.
you're a multinational company, you have to, on the one hand, I imagine, have some kind of a consistent strategy, policy, narrative, positioning on various issues. But you are operating in local markets that may have different domestic policy
Yeah.
objectives, especially now as we're seeing more insularity in terms of how countries behave towards each other. we're seeing to a certain extent a collapse of this kind of um, global liberal economic consensus around free trade.
Yeah.
Uh, and then you're also seeing, you know, big issues like war in Gaza, war in Iran, on which stakeholders, whether it's employees or customers in different countries, might have very strong points of view. So this is a hard question. I don't expect you to give me the answer. This is really more about the process than about the solution. How do you balance all of that up?
It's not an easy thing, and it's not an easy answer to give, right? Because in today's environment, silence is no longer about neutrality. But at the same time, if you speak without understanding local context, it creates a real risk. So you're constantly making judgment calls. And I think that's what many of us in comms are navigating today. And there's no real easy answer to this.
Mhm. And like you said before, you're active in so many places, including in Africa. And, we don't often hear, unfortunately, we don't often hear a lot about how corporates are positioning themselves in specific domestic African countries, for example. How do you stay on top of that kind of grassroots sentiment in those kinds of places where presumably it's crucial for your company?
Yeah. So I think I've had to do personally a lot of unlearning because I guess early in my career, I just assumed that if your message was strong enough, it should work everywhere. And then when I started working across multiple markets, whether it was Africa or different parts of Asia, Middle East, I realized that it doesn't really quite work like that because communication doesn't always flow through formal channels. It moves through communities, through informal networks, through culturally embedded narratives. And then you start to see that trust itself is constructed differently. And in some markets, it's institutional, and in others, it's deeply relational. And I guess Africa, again, is a continent. You have 54 countries in there, and each market behaves very, very differently. But the way your messaging lands in each of those markets can be very, very different. The shift, I think, what I have learned personally is that shift in perspective I've had in how I approach things from a storytelling perspective to a stakeholder engagement perspective has been very, very different. The biggest lesson for me is that cultural adaptability isn't really about translating a message. It's about rethinking how we build trust.
Hmm.
And I think also at the same time, there's a growing pressure to standardize. I see this especially in a lot of multinational companies to create this one global narrative and push it everywhere for efficiency. But that's where there is real risk. Because the minute you start to see a same kind of sameness, it just doesn't feel relevant anymore. Because what stands out is a message that is able to get the balance right. Because if you do global consistency without local relevance, that's just noise.
Yeah. But how do you ensure you don't go too far the other way? Because you can't have 100 different messages, presumably either, right? The
Yeah.
when I went again in Davos, and I think you were at the Edelman Trust
Yes.
Barometer
Yes.
session. The IBM CEO, Arvind Krishna, he said the multinational era is over. And he said, when I go to Germany and Japan, they want to know what I'm doing to help these countries. They're not interested if you're just there to extract profits. And that sounds obvious, but in reality, it must be quite difficult if you're used to operating according to a specific model. And indeed, for multinationals, the value often is in being able to do things at scale and uniform, harmonize their policies and procedures across multiple markets. So, yeah, how do you balance that?
So the smartest way to do this is obviously to work with local partners and then rely on them to give you local intelligence and local guidance. The way I operate, because I have teams in about at least last count, maybe 17, 18 different countries, is we have a very clear global message. This is the message that we want to communicate. And then we give it to our local teams, and then they come back with how they want to implement that messaging. And every market has certain cultural nuances, certain local slang, the way they speak to each other, even the channels of communication sometimes are very, very different because um, we realize that the reliance on traditional institutions is no longer the only way to communicate to your audience, because there are so many informal networks that exist today, depending on which country that you're operating in. So you really, really have to rely on your local partner and take what they say very seriously instead of just looking at them as your implementation partners.
Yeah, well said. And then from a personal perspective, I thought it was interesting you mentioned cultural adaptability as being really important as a personal quality. Um, are there particular steps you think that perhaps are important to become more culturally adaptable? Because it's, I often hear this. You often hear people say, well, you've got to be culturally adaptable, and that sounds great. How do you become more culturally adaptable?
Listen more, speak less. That's really the only way. Because if you try to go into a particular market and try to tell them how to do things, that's not, there's no listening there. There's no way you can adapt. You need to go in there, explain what you're trying to do, and then let people listen. Sorry, then you listen to what they have to say. And then when you're listening, that's when you understand whether what you're trying to do is going to work there or not. And if necessary, pivot, change, do what needs to be done. Because if you're going to be tone deaf to what your local stakeholders are saying, then your message is never going to land. Then it's just a whole lot of noise out there.
Yeah. And I suspect, listening to your comments, it also requires, like you said, curiosity about these places,
Yeah.
a willingness to learn,
Yeah.
and also probably a certain amount of courage to let go.
I think these are all standard traits that you
Mm.
need in order to have a career in comms. I don't think you can succeed in comms without these very, very basic fundamental traits.
Well, you would think so. And I do think, on a personal level, I think most of the successful communicators that I've come across possess these traits. Um, but you see it far less from an organizational perspective. Let's say, for example, I think when you see big companies, multinationals in particular, they appear far less adaptable to different cultures. And I guess perhaps that's the corresponding question is, yes, people can be culturally adaptable, but how do you ensure that companies do not become too stuck in whatever the modus operandi is from head office?
Right. Um, Again, easy for me to answer because I work at the head office and I also have a voice on the board.
Mm,
So I haven't had too much trouble with that, but I completely
mhm,
understand where a lot of my peers come from because they're sometimes stuck pretty much speaking into an echo chamber because nobody's actually listening to them in their head office. And I've come across this, especially the bigger the company is, the harder it is for them to understand how important it is to have that kind of local adaptability. So,
mm.
yeah, it's hard for me to answer it because I've never really faced the challenge. And like I said, I have a voice on the board, so I'm able to actually influence a lot of the decisions. But I know that it's not so easy for many of my peers in the industry.
I think you did answer it. It requires comms people to be on the board. There you go.
Yes,
It requires
that's true. It does.
comms people, good comms people, presumably to be empowered, to have a voice, to be listened to be able to wield that influence responsibly. Um, and again, I do think it's worth noting that this doesn't always happen. Not every senior communicator is going to bring that message of cultural adaptability to the board. It's not always an easy message to
Yeah.
deliver, I would think, right? Even for a company like QI, which is, I think, headquartered in Singapore, or
No, our
is it
headquarters are in
Malaysia?
Hong Kong, Hong
Oh,
Kong and
Hong
Malaysia.
Kong, sorry.
Yeah.
Hong Kong. Yeah, yeah. I do feel like Asian companies are perhaps a little bit more open to this kind of thinking, but even then, it's institutionally it can be difficult. I imagine.
I think it also has to do with leadership. So I guess, in a way, I'm fortunate to work in a company where the leadership actually listens. But it wasn't easy even for me because I had to fight for my place and for my voice to be heard. Because initially they used to be, say, crisis management meetings, right? You should automatically involve somebody from comms in your crisis management meeting. In the early days, I remember there would be a separate crisis management meeting. Decisions would be taken there, and then something would be handed to people in comms and say, "Hey, go, implement it. Go get our message out. Put a press release out there." And most of the time, they have no idea how they arrived at that messaging. So it took me a lot of fighting and a lot of pushing back to get to that point. But then that's the culture of my organization where I'm allowed to do that kind of pushing back and fighting back. So I got lucky. Not everybody else does.
You got lucky, but also you were willing to fight. So I think there's two sides to that coin, right? So
True.
yes, you are in an organization that presumably allows for a level of, let's say, creative dissent.
Yes.
Um, but the willingness to push back is not always something that I think you can take for granted, right? And I think that's a useful lesson as well. I mean,
Yeah.
what would your advice be for a senior communicator who is in a similar situation where, I mean, it sounds crazy, right? Where a crisis plan is determined by, I don't know, the lawyers or whoever, and um, they're not going to take liability for anything, and all the crisis sins that you hear about. What would your advice be for a comms person who is in that situation?
Make friends with the lawyers. That's what I did.
Gosh, so you're going too far now. I think that's
Well, I genuinely had to start building a relationship with the
mm,
general counsel and his team in order to help them understand where I was coming from. And trust me, it worked. It really helped.
mm,
Because if you constantly see the lawyers as your enemies, we're never going to get anywhere. So this is not going to happen over time. You can't just get to the point of crisis and then try to build a relationship. It has to be built over a period of time. It's not just about the lawyers, right? Okay, so the lawyer thing is a bit of a joke,
mm.
but then you have to
Yeah, of
start
course.
building relationships uh, with people
Finance.
who are in those different
Yeah.
roles, and to help them understand what is it that you do and why is it that you need to be involved in the discussions before the decision is made.
It's almost like a form of soft power, which again is so important from a comms perspective. And if you talk to a comms pro, they will say, from an organizational perspective, soft power is even more important when you're trying to change minds. When I recall this conversation at Praxis Asia last year when we did the APAC-D panel, and this was something that the CCOs on stage said. They said you have to form these coalitions and relationships with other functions, whether it's legal or finance or whoever it
Yeah.
is. But it's not necessarily a matrix thing or a strategic plan. Sometimes it's quite informal. Um, but again, I think it's really important to kind of talk about these kinds of lessons, right? Because they don't always show up in the um, in the kind of, well, not that there are any manuals about this, but in the literature, let's say, about how comms people succeed, these kinds of more informal tactics, I feel, are not always given enough attention.
I think comms sometimes tends to work in isolation, and that's where the biggest challenges are. So whenever comms works in isolation, you will see people constantly complaining or struggling to be heard. The minute comms teams start collaborating with others, you're right, it's all about the soft skills. um, I don't know, they don't teach these things in journalism school or comm school or whatever it is that people learn nowadays.
It's a good
It's
point.
just a lot. A lot of things, this is just really relationship.
Mm, yeah, but very important. Very important. Um, I want to finish this by asking you, what kind of people do you look for when it comes to building a successful in-house communications function these days, and how is that changing?
I think, in a way, I've already answered this. I'm always looking for people who are curious and who are willing to experiment. Because without that, we are not going to get very far, especially given the way our comms industry itself is getting disrupted. I was just talking to somebody a few days ago, and I was talking about the fact that we are no longer communicating with human audiences. We are communicating with machines, and how that machine or the system is able to interpret our message, because it's all about now being referenced by AI. It's not really about where you're being published. So, this is changing constantly. We're not really shaping narratives anymore. We're shaping how machines understand those narratives. And unless you are curious enough to constantly learn about what's happening out there and upskilling yourself to deal with whatever new development has taken place, you're going to be left behind.
I suppose that hasn't really changed, though, right? Curiosity has always been important. Um, Willingness to experiment. I guess now more than ever. Um, but I'm also encouraged that you have pointed to what I would call more strategic qualities rather than any particular tactical skills that you're looking for. So it's kind of people that's more important than perhaps any specific functionality they might
Yeah.
bring. So I think that's hopefully that's reassuring. But do you find these people are harder or hard to find?
It's not easy. Let's just put it that way.
Hmm. Yeah, especially when you add in, I guess, when you um, when you take into account the need for more cultural sensitivity and
Yeah.
adaptability these days.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ramya, thank you so much. It's been really interesting to hear about your work at QI, and I will look forward to having you back on the podcast when you can tell us where you next are on the AI journey. Um, yeah, I feel like a lot of change is coming.
Yep. I think we're barely scratching the surface of where we are right now.
Yeah,
So, yeah,
indeed.
the exciting things to come, and we have to stay curious in order to keep up.
I will. I have no doubt that you will stay curious. So, a big thank you for joining the podcast. A big thank you to Earshot, as always, for producing today's show.